Welcome to the IT Interview Challenger channel. We provide a collection of questions and answers primarily focused on IT knowledge to help you prepare for upcoming interviews, practice for exams, or just boost your professional skills. We hope you'll find real value from tuning in.
How can a company prevent accidental deletion of EBS snapshots while allowing for regular management?
The company can change the IAM policy of the user to deny EBS snapshot deletion.
How would you provide secure access for external support engineers to applications running in AWS organizations?
I would ensure that the AWS Systems Manager agent is installed on all instances and assign an instance profile with the necessary policy to connect to Systems Manager. Then I would use AWS IAM Identity Center for console access and Systems Manager Session Manager for permissions.
How would you analyze the performance of a multi-tier web application hosted on AWS during a peak sales period?
I would enable detailed monitoring on all EC2 instances and use Amazon CloudWatch metrics for further analysis.
How would you implement a serverless solution to delete data older than 3 years in an Amazon S3 bucket while retaining a subset of that data?
I would enable S3 inventory, create an AWS Lambda function to filter and delete the objects, and then invoke the Lambda function with S3 batch operations using the inventory reports.
How would you ensure that a non-production application with multiple microservices is secure and available globally with minimal operational overhead?
I would use Amazon CloudFront and Amazon S3 to host the static web front end. Then I would refactor the microservices to use AWS Lambda functions accessed via Amazon API Gateway and migrate the MySQL database to Amazon RDS for MySQL.
How would you ensure compliance while processing sensitive financial data for multiple customers on AWS?
I would generate a unique encryption key for each customer and store those keys in an Amazon S3 bucket, enabling server-side encryption.
How would you migrate millions of files to Amazon S3 while ensuring cost-effectiveness for immediate access and long-term archiving?
I would use an archive tool to group the files into large objects and then copy them to S3 standard infrequent access. After 1 year, I would implement a lifecycle configuration to transition the files to S3 Glacier Instant Retrieval for a retention period of 7 years.
How would you migrate a web application from a monolithic architecture to a serverless microservices architecture using AWS services?
I would configure an Amazon API Gateway REST API to invoke an AWS Lambda function that publishes events to an Amazon Simple Notification Service topic, and then set up subscribers to receive those events.
How would you address high CPU utilization on an EC2 instance that is hosting a monolithic application with tightly coupled modules?
I would resize the EC2 instance to a type with more CPU capacity, configure an auto-scaling group with a minimum and maximum size of 1, and add an RDS read replica to redirect all read-write traffic to the replica.
How would you address performance issues in a monolithic web application hosted on an Amazon EC2 instance?
I would create an Amazon machine image from the web server and reference it in a new launch template. Additionally, I would create an auto-scaling group and an application load balancer to scale horizontally.
How can a company protect sensitive documents stored in an Amazon S3 bucket from deletion or modification for a fixed period of time?
The company should activate S3 object lock on the required objects and enable compliance mode.
What managed solution would you recommend to protect an application hosted on Amazon EC2 instances behind an application load balancer from DDoS attacks?
I would recommend subscribing to AWS Shield Advanced, configuring hosted zones in Route 53, and adding the ALB resources as protected resources.
What steps would you take to ensure that an AWS Lambda function can securely publish notifications to an encrypted Amazon SNS topic containing protected health information?
I would create a resource policy for the SNS topic that allows the Lambda function to publish messages. I would also specify the Lambda function's Amazon resource name in the SNS topic's resource policy and configure a Lambda execution role with the necessary IAM permissions to use the customer-managed key in AWS KMS.
How would you set up an AWS Lambda function to be invoked by an Amazon SNS topic in a different account?
I would create an IAM resource policy for the Lambda function that allows Amazon SNS to invoke it. Additionally, I would create an IAM policy for the SNS topic that permits the Lambda function to subscribe.
How can a company mitigate the risk of a single point of failure for their Amazon RDS for MySQL DB instance with the least implementation effort?
The simplest solution is to modify the RDS DB instance to use a multi-AZ deployment and apply the changes during the next maintenance window.
How would you upgrade a critical web application for scalability and high availability while reducing MySQL read latency?
I would create and configure an auto-scaling group to launch private EC2 instances in multiple AWS regions and add those instances to a target group behind a new application load balancer. Additionally, I would migrate the database to an Amazon Aurora MySQL cluster with cross-region read replicas.
How would you securely store sensitive information for AWS Lambda functions and manage its automatic rotation?
I would store the sensitive information in AWS Secrets Manager and also consider AWS Systems Manager Parameter Store.
What solution would you recommend for sharing data between multiple Amazon EC2 instances within a VPC?
I would recommend configuring an Amazon Elastic file system and mounting it across all instances.
What is the most cost-effective solution for migrating databases to Amazon RDS for PostgreSQL and applications to Amazon EC2 instances, especially for long-running workloads?
The most cost-effective solution would be to purchase reserved instances for a one-year term with the no upfront option for Amazon RDS for PostgreSQL, and also purchase a one-year EC2 instance savings plan with the no upfront option for the EC2 instances.
What solution would you recommend for encrypting confidential data in Amazon S3 while meeting the company's security policies?
I would recommend using server-side encryption with customer-managed AWS KMS keys.
How would you design a robust and resilient architecture for an e-commerce web application on AWS?
I would deploy Amazon EC2 instances in an auto-scaling group across multiple availability zones, set up a multi-AZ RDS database instance, and use Amazon CloudFront to distribute static assets.
How would you distribute near real-time reporting queries across 3 Aurora replicas with different specifications?
I would create and use a custom endpoint for the workload.
How would you replicate data changes from an on-premises Oracle database to Amazon RDS for Oracle using AWS Database Migration Service?
I would configure the AWS DMS replication instance with a multi-AZ deployment to provision instances across multiple availability zones.
What solution would you recommend for securely connecting a corporate network to a VPC while ensuring encryption and controlled access?
I would recommend configuring AWS Transit Gateway to connect to the VPC. This involves setting up route table entries to direct traffic from on-premises to the VPC and configuring instance security groups and network ACLs to allow only the required traffic.
How can a company make their custom application more secure while retrieving information from an Amazon RDS for MySQL database?
They can store the credentials in AWS Secrets Manager, configure the application to load the credentials from there, and set up a credentials rotation schedule using an AWS Lambda function.
What storage solution would you recommend for a company with a web application that has thousands of users and needs to manage user-uploaded images cost-effectively?
I would recommend moving uploaded images to Amazon S3 Glacier Deep Archive, storing premium user-generated images in S3 Standard, and placing non-premium user-generated images in S3 Standard Infrequent Access.
What disaster recovery solution would you implement for a web application running on Amazon EC2 instances with an Aurora MySQL database?
I would deploy the DR infrastructure in a second AWS region with an application load balancer and an auto-scaling group. The auto-scaling group would have its desired and maximum capacity set to a minimum value. I would also convert the Aurora MySQL DB cluster to an Aurora Global database and configure Amazon Route 53 for active-passive failover with the ALB endpoints.
What steps would you take to design a cost-effective hybrid network architecture for workloads in AWS and on-premises data centers that require low latency?
I would associate an AWS Direct Connect gateway with the Transit Gateway attached to the VPCs and establish an AWS Direct Connect connection, creating a transit virtual interface to the Direct Connect gateway.
How can a company schedule its Amazon RDS instances to run only during business hours with minimal operational overhead?
The company can create an Amazon Event Bridge rule that invokes AWS Lambda functions to start and stop the RDS instances.
How would you mitigate DDoS attacks on a public e-commerce website hosted on AWS using Global Accelerator?
I would configure an AWS WAF Web ACL for the Global Accelerator to block traffic using rate-based rules.
What solution would you recommend for designing a cloud architecture for a stateless application on AWS that requires parallel processing and durable job storage?
I would recommend creating an Amazon Simple Queue service queue to hold the jobs that need to be processed. Then I would set up an auto-scaling group using the launch template, with a scaling policy based on the number of items in the SQS queue.
What is the recommended way to encrypt sensitive data before storing it in Amazon S3?
The recommended way is to use server-side encryption with AWS KMS keys, also known as SSE KMS.
How can a company ensure that each team's big data workloads on an Amazon EMR cluster can only access the necessary AWS services?
The company can create EMR runtime roles, configure the cluster to use those roles, and then use the roles to submit the big data workloads.
What AWS solution would you recommend for migrating an on-premises search application that collects streaming data?
I would recommend using Amazon Kinesis data streams to ingest and process the data streams to Amazon OpenSearch service, which can be used to search the data. For visualizations, Amazon QuickSight would be suitable.
What is the best way to securely store and retrieve employee credentials in an internal web application on AWS with minimal operational overhead?
The best solution is to store the credentials in AWS Secrets Manager and use AWS Cloud Formation along with the BatchGet Secret Value API to retrieve the usernames and passwords.
How would you migrate an on-premises stock trading application to the AWS Cloud while ensuring high availability and low latency access to block storage across multiple availability zones?
I would configure a Windows Server cluster that spans 2 availability zones on Amazon EC2 instances, install the application on both nodes, and use Amazon FSx for Windows File Server as shared storage.
How would you set up an application on AWS that allows users to upload photos to an S3 bucket using CloudFront and a custom domain?
I would use AWS Certificate Manager to create a public certificate in the U.S. East 1 region for CloudFront, and I would configure Amazon S3 to allow uploads from CloudFront Origin Access Control.
How can a company ensure that users are directed to the nearest EC2 instances when implementing an application on AWS?
The company should implement an Amazon Route 53 geo-proximity routing policy and use an internet-facing network load balancer to distribute traffic across all availability zones within the same region.
What solution would you recommend for migrating an on-premises Oracle database to Amazon RDS for Oracle while meeting regulatory data retention requirements?
I would recommend creating Amazon RDS automated backups and setting the retention period to 90 days.
How can an application hosted on Amazon EC2 instances securely access specific S3 buckets while ensuring minimal operational overhead?
The best solution is to create a gateway endpoint for Amazon S3 attached to the VPC, and then update the IAM instance profile policy to allow access only to the specific buckets needed by the application.
What solution would you recommend for granting secure access to Amazon RDS and S3 while ensuring confidentiality of sensitive customer data?
I would enable IAM Identity Center with an Identity Center directory, create permission sets with granular access to Amazon RDS and S3, and assign the teams to specific groups with those permission sets.
How would you grant temporary access to sensitive data files in an Amazon S3 bucket for an application running in an on-premises data center?
I would use IAM roles anywhere to obtain security credentials in IAM Identity Center that grant access to the S3 bucket and configure the virtual machines to assume the role using the AWS CLI.
What solution would you recommend for a company looking to serve dynamic content globally to millions of customers?
I would recommend creating an Amazon CloudFront distribution and configuring the existing application load balancer as the origin.
What solution would you recommend for providing multiple EC2 instances in an autoscaling group access to a shared data volume?
I would recommend provisioning an Amazon Elastic file system and configuring it to use general-purpose performance mode.
What steps would you take to ensure that Amazon EC2 instances are tagged correctly with data sensitivity in an AWS environment?
I would create a tag policy in AWS organizations specifying the data sensitivity tag key and required values, then enforce those values for the EC2 instances. Additionally, I would create a service control policy to deny instance creation without a tag and another SCP to prevent tag deletion, attaching both to the appropriate organizational unit.
If a company needs to migrate a legacy application using NFS for storage, what solution would you recommend?
I would recommend Amazon Elastic File System as it supports NFS and can seamlessly integrate with the application.
What is the most secure way for a software development team to connect to an Amazon RDS multi-AZ cluster from their office?
The most secure solution is to create a VPC with 2 private subnets. Place the RDS cluster in those private subnets and use AWS site-to-site VPN with a customer gateway in the office.
How would you ensure that database credentials for an Amazon Aurora MySQL DB cluster are encrypted and rotated every 14 days with minimal operational effort?
I would create a new AWS Key Management Service encryption key and use AWS Secrets Manager to create a secret with the appropriate credentials. Then, I would associate the secret with the Aurora DB cluster and configure a custom rotation period of 14 days.
How would you migrate an on-premises application running on a Kubernetes cluster to AWS while minimizing operational overhead?
I would use AWS Fargate to supply compute capacity, create a Fargate profile, and then deploy the application using that profile.
What would be the most cost-effective solution for a new application requiring a scalable structured database with backups?
The most cost-effective solution would be to use Amazon Aurora Serverless for the database, with serverless capacity scaling and automated backups to Amazon S3.
What recommendation would you make to improve the performance of an e-commerce website during product catalog searches?
I would recommend implementing an Amazon Elasticache for Redis cluster to cache the product catalog and use lazy loading to populate the cache.
How would you address scaling issues in a food delivery service's order processing system during peak traffic hours?
I would provision 2 Amazon Simple Queue service queues, one for order collection and the other for order fulfillment. The EC2 instances would poll their respective queues, and I would scale the auto-scaling groups based on the number of messages in each queue.
What storage solution would you recommend for an on-premises media rendering application that needs low latency access to data stored in Amazon S3?
I would configure an Amazon S3 file gateway to provide storage for the on-premises application.
How would you automate the customer survey process to ensure results are available for the previous 12 months?
I would send the survey results data to an Amazon API gateway endpoint connected to an Amazon Simple Queue service queue. Then, I would create an AWS Lambda function to poll the SQS queue, call Amazon Comprehend for sentiment analysis, and save the results to an Amazon DynamoDB table with a TTL set for 365 days in the future.
How can a medical company transform clinical trial data while ensuring it is encrypted using customer-specific keys?
The best solution is to create one Amazon EMR cluster for each customer and use server-side encryption with AWS KMS keys to encrypt the data.
How can a company optimize costs associated with encrypting S3 objects while using AWS KMS?
The company can use an S3 bucket key for server-side encryption with AWS KMS keys on the new objects.
What steps would you take to securely integrate Amazon S3 with an application that uses Amazon Cognito for user authentication?
I would create an Amazon Cognito identity pool to generate secure Amazon S3 access tokens for users upon successful login, and I would create an Amazon S3 VPC endpoint in the same VPC where the application is hosted.
How would you improve the performance of a 3-tier web application that experiences order processing delays during peak times?
I would implement an Amazon EC2 auto-scaling target tracking policy to scale out the processing tier instances using the approximate number of messages attribute to determine when to scale.
How would you migrate a monolithic application for image processing to AWS while reducing operational overhead?
I would use AWS batch jobs to process the images and AWS step functions to orchestrate the workflow. The processed files can be stored in an Amazon S3 bucket.
How can a company ensure that traffic from an application in a private subnet to Amazon S3 does not travel across the internet?
The most cost-effective solution is to configure an S3 gateway endpoint and update the VPC route table to use that endpoint.
What solution would you recommend for providing secure access to AWS resources for a globally distributed development team while integrating with an on-premises Active Directory?
I would recommend using AD Connector in AWS Directory Service to connect to the on-premises Active Directory. This can be integrated with AWS IAM Identity Center to configure permission sets for each Active Directory group, allowing access to specific AWS accounts and resources.
Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to keep up with our upcoming videos. See you next time.